The splintered floorboards of the old dance studio groaned under the weight of her feet, a familiar lament that echoed the ache in her bones. Kesha moved with a ghost-like grace, her silhouette a stark contrast against the single shaft of moonlight that sliced through the grimy window. It was past midnight, and the city below was a distant hum of sleeping ambitions and forgotten dreams. For her, this dusty room tucked away in the forgotten corner of an industrial district was both a sanctuary and a prison. It was the only place left where she could be Kesha Morrow, not the anonymous cleaner who scrubbed the marble floors of Manhattan's elite. 15 years. The number was a tombstone in her mind. 15 years since a car accident, a sudden violent twist of fate had stolen her career. It wasn't the crash itself that had killed her spirit. It was the quiet, cold aftermath. The doctors had been brutally honest her legs would never be the same. The public who had once adored her moved on, and the patrons, the powerful men who had once vied for her attention, vanished like smoke. Chief among them was William Thompson III, the titan of industry who had sponsored the very performance that had ended her world. He had seen a broken dancer, not a broken person, and had simply cut his losses. His abandonment had been a silent verdict more painful than any physical injury. She glided across the floor, a phantom of her former self. The movements were fluid, perfect, a testament to muscle memory that refused to die. Yet there was an undercurrent of sorrow in every step, a deep, abiding sadness that even her most perfect pirouette could not hide. She could still feel the phantom audience, the roar of the applause, the blinding stage lights. But those were just memories, beautiful and cruel in their impossibility. A sudden sharp pang shot through her left knee. She faltered, the illusion of grace shattering like glass. A gasp escaped her lips as she braced herself against the cold, rough wall. The pain was real, a brutal reminder that the body she once commanded with such effortless power was now a fragile, unreliable thing. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, not from the pain, but from the humiliation of her own physical betrayal. She limped over to her bag, pulling out her phone. The screen was a portal to another life, one of mundane tasks and minimum wage. An email notification flashed a new contract from a high-end event company. She sighed, her thumb hovering over the delete button. She didn't want to work tonight. Her body ached, her spirit was low. She just wanted to be here in her self-imposed exile to dance and mourn in peace. But something in the subject line caught her eye. Thompson Holdings Annual Gala. Her blood ran cold. The name alone was a trigger, a key to a vault of pain and betrayal she had long tried to bury. Her first instinct was to delete the email, to pretend she had never seen it, to run from the ghost of her past. But then a different feeling took hold. A cold, hard resolve she hadn't felt in years. It was a flicker of the old fire, the fierce determination that had made her a star. She read the details: a high-profile party attended by all of Manhattan's elite celebrating the opening of a new skyscraper. The very symbol of the wealth and power that had once courted her and then discarded her. The thought of stepping into that world, not as a celebrated artist, but as an invisible servant, was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet the bitterness fueled her. She remembered William Thompson's condescending words at a post-performance dinner long before the accident. "Talent is a fleeting thing, Miss Morrow. It's best to use it while you can, because when it's gone, so is your value." He had said it with a smile, a casual cruelty that had stung even then. She had dismissed it as the cynicism of the wealthy. Now she knew it was the gospel by which he lived. The idea of facing him again, of seeing the man who had cast her aside, was both terrifying and intoxicating. What would he say? Would he even remember her? Probably not. To him, she was just another face in a long line of fleeting attractions and investments. He wouldn't recognize the woman who now cleaned the floors he walked on, and that anonymity, she realized, was her most potent weapon. She could go, she could be there, a silent witness to his arrogance, a ghost haunting his triumph. She could see how he had aged, how his empire had grown, while her own world had been reduced to a single room and a broom. The thought was a chilling comfort. It was a morbid curiosity, a need to see the face of the man who had in a way signed her death warrant. It was a way to reclaim a small piece of control, to choose to be there instead of being dragged there by fate. Her thumb moved slowly, deliberately. She didn't delete the email. She accepted the job. It was a foolish, reckless decision, a leap of faith into a darkness she knew held nothing but pain. But the old adage, "If you can't beat them, join them," felt wrong. Kesha wasn't joining them. She was infiltrating them. She would enter his world on her own terms, a silent shadow among the glittering guests. It was a small victory, but for a woman who had lost everything, it felt like a monumental one. She returned to the center of the studio, her muscles still protesting. The moonlight was her only spotlight now. She didn't dance for an audience, for a critic, or for a patron. She danced for herself. Her movements were not for performance, but for survival. Every turn, every extension, every leap was a defiant declaration that while they had broken her career, they had not broken her spirit. The fire was still there, flickering in the shadows, waiting for its moment to blaze. Little did she know that moment was fast approaching, and it would not be a quiet, private flame, but a consuming inferno that would burn down the very world that had cast her out. She danced until the moon set, until her body was a symphony of protest, and her mind was a whirlwind of memories and resolve. She would go to the Thompson Gala. She would face the past. And she would not be a victim. She would be an observer, a ghost in the machine waiting for the perfect moment to reveal that some broken things can still be dangerous. The air in the Thompson Tower ballroom was thick with the scent of money and old-world perfume. Kesha moved through the crowd, a silent phantom in a black uniform, her eyes meticulously scanning the floor for any stray debris. She was a professional, a ghost in the machine of high-end events, and her job was to ensure the flawless veneer of perfection was never disturbed. But tonight, that veneer felt like a lie. Every polished surface reflected a reality. She no longer belonged to a world where the only value was the price tag. The hall itself was a cathedral of opulence. Soaring ceilings dripped with crystal chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with modern art that cost more than a small nation's GDP. Waiters floated by with trays of champagne, their movements as precise and practiced as a ballet. It was a stark and cruel contrast to the meager existence she now led. She had once floated through rooms like this, but as a celebrated guest, not a servant. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue. She saw him then standing at the center of the main reception area, his back to her. William Thompson III, a figure of power and authority surrounded by a court of sycophants. His voice, when it carried across the room, was a low, arrogant rumble. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of both fear and a cold, simmering rage. This was the man who had abandoned her, who had looked at her broken body and seen only a ruined investment. He was older now, his hair a distinguished silver, but his posture was still as imperious as ever. Her cleaning cart, a wheeled extension of her anonymity, was her only shield. She pushed it methodically, her gaze fixed on the marble floor. A waiter, distracted by a beautiful woman, stumbled. A tray of delicate crystal glasses teetered, then slid. Time seemed to slow as Kesha watched the shattering descent. The crystal tray hit the polished marble with a deafening crash, a sound that sliced through the polite chatter and music like a knife. The hall fell silent. Every eye turned to the mess on the floor and to the figure kneeling beside it. It was a moment of utter public stillness, the kind that makes the air crackle with tension. And in that moment, William Thompson III turned around. His eyes, cold and assessing, found Kesha's. There was no flicker of recognition, only annoyance. "What is this?" he bellowed, his voice carrying the weight of his power. "An exhibition of incompetence." Kesha's trembling hands reached out to pick up the largest shards, but her gaze remained locked on his. She didn't see a powerful man. She saw a ghost from her past, a reminder of everything she had lost. The pain in her knees from her secret late-night rehearsals was a dull throb, a constant presence, but it was overshadowed by the searing emotional pain of his contempt. "Dad, you're being ridiculous," a voice whispered from behind him. It was Jonathan Thompson, his son, a young man who radiated a quiet discomfort. Jonathan's face was pale, his eyes wide with a mix of embarrassment and pity. His father, however, completely ignored him, clearly enjoying his public display of dominance. William Thompson III strode toward Kesha, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly on the marble. He held a champagne flute, pointing it at her like a scepter. "It seems you lack the coordination to handle a simple tray," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I wonder if you possess any coordination at all. Tell me, can you move to the beat of a waltz? Or is your lack of grace a permanent affliction?" The crowd, which had been silent, now began to murmur. A few snickers erupted from the shadows. The sheer cruelty of his joke was breathtaking. To ask a person who had just stumbled and dropped something if they could dance to mock their lack of coordination in front of a room full of people was an act of pure malice. Kesha remained kneeling, a silent and dignified statue. The crystal shards were a bed of glitter around her. Her hands trembled, but her eyes held a calm that no one in the room could decipher. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't fear. It was something far more dangerous, a quiet, simmering resolve that promised an eruption. A discreet figure approached William, a man in a crisp suit who was clearly an event manager. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps it would be better if we—" "Better nothing." William cut him off, gesturing dramatically. "Play a waltz. Now, if she can dance better than my wife Victoria, I will marry my son to her on the spot. Just imagine the heir to the Thompson fortune marrying the cleaning lady." A wave of collective laughter rippled through the hall. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated cruelty. Some of the women covered their mouths, but their eyes sparkled with malicious amusement. The men shook their heads as if watching a perfectly acceptable comedy. Jonathan Thompson looked sick to his stomach, a vein throbbing at his temple as his father made a spectacle of him and of Kesha. Kesha finally stood up. She wiped her hands on the apron of her uniform, slowly, methodically. Her gaze, which had been downcast, now lifted to meet William's. For a moment, a long, drawn-out moment that felt like an eternity, she said nothing. She was making a decision that would change not just that night, but the entire power dynamic of that room. The decision was not about accepting a challenge, but about embracing her past. She had tried to hide from it, to bury it under layers of anonymity. But William Thompson, in his arrogant cruelty, had unearthed it. He had unwittingly opened a door that had been sealed for 15 years, a door to a power he could never comprehend. "I accept," she said. Her voice was clear, cutting through the mocking laughter like a sharp blade. The hall fell completely silent. The orchestra, which had been cued to play the waltz for Victoria, stopped, confused by the unexpected turn of events. William Thompson blinked several times. He seemed to think he had misheard. "What did you say?" he asked, his arrogance momentarily shaken by her unexpected response. "I said, I accept your challenge," Kesha repeated, a subtle smile touching her lips. "But when I dance better than your wife, you will keep your word even if it was said as a joke." It was at this point that some in the audience began to truly pay attention. This was not a simple act of humiliation. This was a confrontation. As the guests began to whisper, no one noticed the familiar gleam in Kesha's eyes, the same gleam that had once captivated audiences on the world's most prestigious stages. The gleam of a performer who was about to take back control of her own narrative. The battle lines were drawn, the stage was set, and the waltz was about to begin. The air was heavy with anticipation, a silence so profound it seemed to have a physical weight pressing down on every guest and staff member in the room. The collective laughter had died the moment Kesha's quiet, firm voice had cut through the noise, leaving an echo of a more serious, more dangerous game afoot. William Thompson, his face a mask of shock and annoyance, took a step back, his arrogant smirk replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected her to cower, to beg, to melt into the floor in a puddle of shame. Her defiance was a challenge he had not anticipated, a variable in his carefully orchestrated spectacle of humiliation. "Very well," he said, recovering his composure with a forced smile. "The girl has guts, but guts alone don't win a game." He turned to his wife Victoria, who had been watching from the sidelines with a venomous smile of her own. She was a woman known for her ballroom dancing lessons, a fact she never failed to mention to her social circle. Her confidence was a brittle shell, but in this moment it seemed impenetrable. "Darling, do you really think I need to lower myself to compete with this?" Victoria said, gesturing dismissively toward Kesha as if she were a piece of misplaced furniture. "This is a charity event, not a sideshow." Her words were meant to be a final crushing blow, a way to end the charade before it began, but William, drunk on power, and the $1,000 whiskey, refused to back down. "Don't be modest, Victoria," he replied, clearly enjoying the situation. "You won that club waltz trophy last year. That should be more than enough for this demonstration." Kesha stood motionless, her face an unreadable mask. But her mind had already flown back 15 years to a world that no one here could comprehend. She remembered the nights when entire audiences rose to their feet, their applause a physical force. The reviews that compared her to the greatest ballerinas in history. The feeling of flying across the stage, a weightless extension of the music itself. She wasn't just a dancer. She was a storyteller, a physical poet who could convey a universe of emotion with a single graceful arc of her arm, and then a memory sharp as a dagger sliced through her reverie. It was the night of the special performance for the political elite, a performance William Thompson III himself had personally sponsored. She had been at the peak of her career, and he had been her biggest patron, a man who seemed to see her not just as an investment, but as a masterpiece he had helped to craft. He had been there backstage with a celebratory glass of champagne and had given her a chillingly paternalistic hug before she left for the night. "Don't forget who helped you get here, little bird." He had said, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You owe me. Always." The car accident on the way home, a cruel twist of fate on a slick, dark road, had been the end of everything. 3 months in a coma. A cruel awakening to reality. Her legs would never be the same again. The doctors said she would be lucky to ever walk normally. Dance professionally impossible. She had been broken, and in William Thompson's world, broken things were worthless. His calls stopped. The donations from his foundation, which had kept her company afloat, ceased. She had been discarded, a ruined masterpiece, and he had simply moved on to the next. The pain of that memory was a fire in her belly, a deeper ache than any physical one. It was not just about the loss of a career. It was about the loss of her identity, and the betrayal of a man who had feigned interest and care only to abandon her the moment she became inconvenient. His current cruelty was not a surprise. It was a continuation of a character she had already seen. "Jonathan," William said, his voice cutting into her thoughts. "Go get your camera. I want to record this moment for posterity. The day a cleaning lady tried to pass herself off as a dancer at my event." Jonathan Thompson, his face a study in discomfort, hesitated. "Dad, this has gone too far. The girl was just doing her job." The girl, William cut him off, sarcastically accepted the challenge, and now she's going to entertain us. "Or would you rather I tell your girlfriend about that embarrassing situation last week?" Jonathan's face paled. Kesha, watching the exchange, felt a pang of pity for him. Blackmail. Another demonstration of the toxic control William exerted over everyone around him. He saw people not as human beings, but as pieces on a chessboard to be moved and manipulated at his will. It was a suffocating, lonely existence, even in a room full of people. "Put the music on," William ordered the DJ, "and place your bets." The cruel laughter echoed through the room once more. Some guests actually began placing bets, treating the situation as a form of free entertainment. Victoria positioned herself in the center of the dance floor, doing a few theatrical stretches to show off her experience, a peacock, preening for a crowd of vultures. "You know what," William said, approaching Kesha with a wicked smile. "When you lose, and you will lose, I want you to get down on your knees and apologize for wasting everyone's time. And then, obviously, you're fired." It was at that moment that something changed in Kesha's eyes. The pain and the memories, the humiliation and the betrayal, they all condensed into a single unbreakable force. The same determination that had led her to dance on international stages. The same strength that had made her fight through months of brutal physical therapy just to walk again. The same dignity that had kept her alive when she lost everything. She had been through worse than this. This room full of privileged, shallow people was nothing compared to the long, dark nights of recovery, the silence of a life that had been snatched away. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice a calm, steady counterpoint to his arrogant bravado. "When I win, and I will win, I want you to keep your word about the marriage. But I also want something else." William raised his eyebrows, amused by her audacity. "Oh, she wants to make demands now. Very well. Amuse me. What else do you want besides marrying my son? I want you to admit in front of all these guests that you judged a woman wrongly based on the color of her skin and the work she does." Kesha said, her voice growing stronger. "And I want a public apology." The room tensed. The whispers grew louder. This had taken a turn no one had expected. This was no longer a simple joke. It was a moral confrontation. William laughed loudly, a booming theatrical sound that was meant to dispel the tension. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. All right, I accept. But when you make a fool of yourself, you'll leave here not only without a job, but without any dignity left. What William Thompson III didn't know was that he was about to face not just a cleaning lady with a mysterious past, but a woman who had lost everything once and knew exactly how to fight for every crumb of respect. While Victoria prepared herself with basic ballroom dance moves across the dance floor, a silent storm was brewing. The air had changed. The music had yet to begin, but the prelude was already underway. The stage was set, and the true battle was not about dance, but about dignity, power, and the ghosts of a forgotten past. A tense silence hung in the air, a vacuum between William Thompson's arrogant taunts and Kesha's quiet defiance. Victoria, now positioned in the center of the dance floor, looked more like a theatrical prop than a competitor. Her movements when the music finally began were competent but predictable. She had learned to dance at elite clubs with expensive private teachers, but her technique was clearly amateurish by professional standards. She executed a series of turns and steps that were technically correct, but devoid of any real emotion or soul. Still, she received polite applause from the audience. To them, she represented everything they considered appropriate wealth, a certain social standing, and a polished, if superficial, grace. "Well done, dear," William said, applauding exaggeratedly as the music ended. "Now it's time for our guest artist." The smirk on his face was back a mask of confident cruelty. He gestured toward Kesha with a flourish, as if presenting a clown at a circus. Kesha slowly walked to the center of the dance floor. Every step was measured, controlled, and laden with a dignity that began to make some of those present uncomfortable. This was not how a defeated person was supposed to behave. She was not cowering or stumbling. She held her head high, her back straight. A quiet storm of strength radiated from her, a palpable energy that even the most cynical guests began to feel. "What song would you like?" the DJ asked, more out of politeness than genuine consideration. "The same one," Kesha replied simply, "but from the beginning." William laughed. "Oh, she wants a second chance. How lovely." He clapped his hands together. "All right, play the song. Let's see how long she lasts before she gives up." What none of them knew was that Kesha had strategically chosen that song. It was a waltz she had danced hundreds of times during her career. It was a piece she knew by heart, one that flowed through her muscle memory like a second language. More importantly, it was the music to one of the last performances she had given before the accident, a night at the National Theater, where she had received a 5-minute standing ovation in a performance that critics had described as transcendent and one of the most emotionally devastating in the history of American dance. As she waited for the music to begin, Kesha closed her eyes. The ballroom faded away, the taunts and the stares of the privileged elite became a distant hum. She allowed her memories to take her back to that night 15 years ago. She remembered the feeling of flying across the stage, the deep connection with each musical note, the absolute certainty that she had been born to do this. The doctors had said she would never dance again. The media had speculated that her career was definitely over. She herself had believed it for years until slowly and painfully she began to rebuild not only her muscles, but her relationship with dance. She had never returned to the stage. She had never tried to resume her career, but she had never stopped dancing. In secret, alone, during the most difficult moments of her new life, dance had been her solace, her therapy, her one true friend. It had been the only thing left that still belonged to her, a sacred practice no one could take away. The first bars of the waltz echoed through the hall, and with them something extraordinary was about to happen. Under the weight of all those condescending glances, her hands positioned themselves with a precision that made some of the musicians frown, instinctively recognizing that they were about to witness something far beyond a simple amateur dance. Kesha began to move. It was not the hesitant steps everyone expected to see. Instead, she rose with a grace that made the air in the room change instantly, as if gravity had lost some of its power over her. Her first movements were subtle, almost shy, allowing the audience to keep their expectations low. But as the music gained momentum, something extraordinary began to happen. Each step became more fluid, each turn more precise, each movement charged with a deep emotion that began to mesmerize everyone present. William Thompson stopped laughing. Victoria's strained smile completely vanished. The entire room began to realize that they weren't watching a cleaning lady trying to dance. They were witnessing an artist reclaiming her place in the world. "My God," someone in the audience murmured, a patron of the arts who had seen her dance years ago. She's exceptional." Kesha performed a sequence of pirouettes that would be challenging for any professional ballerina, followed by a grand jeté that lifted her into the air with a lightness that defied physics. These were not ballroom dance moves. This was classical ballet of the highest order, masterfully adapted to the waltz. It was a story told through her body, a narrative of pain, loss, and resilience. Marcus, keeping his promise, had discreetly positioned his cell phone to record not only the performance, but the audience's reactions, especially the face of William Thompson. The millionaire's expression had gone from scorn to confusion then, to something close to terror. "This is impossible," William whispered to himself, his voice catching. "Who the hell is this woman?" It was when Kesha performed the final sequence of her old National Theater performance, a combination of movements that had been her trademark, a unique fusion of classical techniques she had created herself, that the truth began to strike some of those present like a bolt of lightning. "Wait a minute," said a woman in the audience, a longtime fan of the ballet. "I know those moves. I've seen that sequence before." But where? Jonathan Thompson was completely mesmerized, his camera capturing every second of the performance. Unlike his father, he recognized genius when he saw it, regardless of who displayed it. He saw not a cleaning lady, but the artist he had once adored from afar, the legend who had mysteriously vanished. When the music reached its climax, Kesha performed a series of fouettes, continuous turns on one leg, that left the entire audience speechless. These were movements that required not only perfect technique, but years of training and extraordinary physical strength. The music came to an end, and Kesha finished in a pose that was simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. Her arms were outstretched, her head held high with absolute dignity. Her breathing was controlled despite the intensity of the performance. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. It was the kind of silence that occurs when an audience witnesses something that transcends their wildest expectations. Then slowly, one person began to applaud, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, applauding with an intensity that made the windows rattle. "Bravo!" someone shouted. "Extraordinary!" echoed another. William Thompson stood pale as a ghost, realizing that he had just been completely humiliated by someone he considered inferior. Worse, he had done so in front of Manhattan's elite, who now looked at him with a mixture of disapproval and embarrassment. The stage was hers, and he, the so-called master of ceremonies, had just become the fool. The silence that followed Kesha's final pose was more thunderous than any applause. It was a vacuum of disbelief, a collective suspension of reality, as 200 people accustomed to a world of predictable hierarchies struggled to process what they had just witnessed. William Thompson's face was a study in profound shock. The color had drained from it, leaving a ghostly pallor that made his arrogant sneer seem like a distant, faded memory. Victoria, his wife, looked on with a mixture of terror and mortification, her perfect coiffure and expensive dress suddenly seeming cheap and ridiculous in the wake of Kesha's raw, unadorned talent. Slowly, the silence began to break. The first person to applaud was a young woman in the back, a student of the arts who had recognized the rare genius on display. Her single clap was a tiny tremor that quickly grew into a seismic wave. Within moments, the entire hall was on its feet, a roaring tide of cheers and bravos. It was more than just applause for a beautiful performance. It was a spontaneous show of support for a woman who had, with nothing but her own dignity and talent, brought a man of immense power to his knees. Amidst the chaos, a man in a discreet security uniform moved toward the center of the dance floor. It was Marcus, the head of security, his face a mixture of admiration and quiet triumph. He held his phone high, the red recording light glowing like a beacon. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming over the cheers, "allow me to introduce Kesha Morrow, former principal soloist with the American National Ballet." The name echoed through the hall like a bomb. The cheering died down, replaced by a wave of gasps and exclamations of shock. Kesha Morrow was a name from a distant past, a legendary ballerina who had mysteriously disappeared at the height of her career. A few older patrons of the arts, the ones who truly understood what they had just seen, felt a cold shiver run down their spines. The ghost of a legend was standing before them, alive and defiant. "Impossible!" Victoria Thompson stammered, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Kesha Morrow is dead, or at least, she never danced again after the accident." Kesha finally broke her silence, a small knowing smile on her lips. "Clearly," she said, her voice calm and clear, The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. The crowd laughed nervously, a sound that was at once a release of tension and a confirmation of the incredible situation. But William Thompson wasn't laughing. The reality of what had happened hit him like a freight train. He had publicly humiliated one of the greatest entertainers in American history. And worse, he had done so on tape in front of 200 of his most important peers and competitors. Marcus, still holding the phone, turned to William. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "You said that if she danced better than your wife, you would marry her to your son. I believe this entire audience can attest to the fact that the condition has been more than met." Jonathan, seeing where the situation was going, approached Kesha. He was no longer the embarrassed boy from earlier. In his eyes there was a newfound respect and a quiet determination. "Miss Morrow," he said, his voice sincere and full of regret, "I would like to publicly apologize for my father's behavior. It was inexcusable." Jonathan shut up. William exploded, his mask of control finally slipping completely. "You will not apologize to anyone, especially not to her." It was at that moment that Kesha revealed the true extent of her plan, the calculated precision behind her every move. The dance had not been the climax. The humiliation had not been the end goal. This was, "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to his explosive rage. "I believe we have a marriage proposal to discuss. After all, a man of your standing surely keeps his word, doesn't he?" The audience fell silent again, realizing they were witnessing something much greater than a simple display of talent. They were watching an act of poetic justice, a public reckoning for a lifetime of arrogance and cruelty. William was visibly shaking with rage. "You must be crazy if you think I'm going to honor a drunken joke," he growled, his face turning a deep crimson. "Ah, but it wasn't a joke," Kesha said, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "Marcus, could you play back the recording of Mr. Thompson's statements from tonight?" Marcus held his phone high for everyone to hear. The clear, undeniable recording of William making the bet, doubling the conditions, increasing the humiliations, and publicly declaring that he would marry his son to her if she won the challenge, filled the silent hall. "And here he is confirming the terms," the recording continued, "even after I specified that he would have to keep his word." The audience murmured, some laughing nervously, others clearly embarrassed by the situation William had created for himself. "That's blackmail," William shouted, completely losing his composure. "No," Kesha corrected him calmly. "This is accountability. You made a public bet with clear terms in front of 200 witnesses. Now you have to decide if you are a man of your word or if your reputation is worth less than your prejudice." Jonathan moved closer to Kesha, his gaze fixed on his father. "Miss Morrow," he said, his voice full of an unexpected strength, "if you will allow me, I would like to honor my father's word. Not because I am forced to, but because any man would be honored to marry someone of your talent and dignity." The audience murmured, surprised by the unexpected romantic turn. William was now visibly shaking with a white-hot fury. "Jonathan, if you do this, you're out of the company, out of the family, out of everything." "Then so be it," Jonathan replied, extending his hand to Kesha. "Some things are more important than money, Dad, like having integrity." Kesha looked at the outstretched hand, then at the audience, and finally at William Thompson, who was clearly having what appeared to be a nervous breakdown in public. Her true victory wasn't in forcing a marriage, but in forcing him to face the very values he had always scorned. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice filled with a quiet power that commanded the attention of the entire room. 15 years ago, people like you decided I had no value after I became imperfect. Today you tried to humiliate me based on the color of my skin and the work I do to survive. But you know what I've discovered: true nobility doesn't come from inheritance or bank accounts. It comes from how we treat other human beings when we think no one is watching." She turned to Jonathan, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time that night. "Your son seems to have learned that lesson despite your best efforts." She looked back at William, her eyes holding a final crushing verdict. "As for the proposal, I'll accept dinner with him, but marriage, well, that's something two people decide together based on love and respect, not humiliating bets." The audience erupted in applause again, but this time it wasn't just for the dance. It was for the dignity and wisdom Kesha had shown. William Thompson, realizing he had lost not only the bet but the respect of everyone present, including his own son, muttered something about leaving it to the lawyers, and stormed out of the hall, followed by Victoria, who was clearly mortified by the entire situation. Marcus, his phone still recording, smiled, knowing he had captured a moment that would change everything. The grand ballroom, once a stage for William Thompson's arrogant theatrics, had transformed into a whirlwind of whispers and stunned expressions. As he stormed out, his wife trailing behind him like a shattered porcelain doll, the collective shock began to give way to a feverish exchange of information. Kesha, still standing at the center of the room, found herself surrounded by a different kind of crowd. Not the vultures who had placed bets on her humiliation, but a group of a few discerning patrons, journalists, and event planners who had recognized the rare confluence of talent and drama they had just witnessed. They murmured her name, Kesha Morrow, as if it were a long-forgotten sacred word, their eyes wide with disbelief and a newfound reverence. Amidst the swirling storm of new attention, Jonathan Thompson's presence was an anchor. He had not moved from her side. His hand, which had been outstretched in a gesture of genuine admiration, now rested on her arm, a silent promise of support. He wasn't looking at the crowd or at his father's receding figure. He was looking at her, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. The son of the man who had tried to break her was now her most steadfast ally. "Miss Morrow," he said, his voice low and private amidst the public clamor. I don't even know what to say. My father's behavior was beyond words." "It was exactly as expected," Kesha replied, her voice still calm, though a flicker of exhaustion was beginning to show in her eyes. The adrenaline from the performance was fading, replaced by the heavy weight of a past she had just unearthed for all the world to see. He acted as he always has. Jonathan's brow furrowed. You know him from before." Kesha looked at him for the first time. The boy who had been a silent, embarrassed witness to his father's cruelty was gone. In his place was a man with a quiet strength in his eyes, a depth of character that she hadn't expected. She saw in him not the cold ambition of his father, but a genuine humility. The words she chose to speak next were a test, a way to see if he was truly different. "Yes," she said simply, "he was one of the many patrons who invested in my career. And when the investment broke, he walked away without a second thought." A cloud of understanding passed over Jonathan's face. The embarrassment he had felt earlier was now replaced by a deep, palpable sorrow. He did the same to my mother's family business years ago. He invested in their company, promised them a place on the board, and then squeezed them out when he found a better opportunity. He sees everything as a transaction. People, relationships. It's all just business to him. Kesha felt a pang of empathy for the young man. He was a prisoner in his own life, bound by the very wealth and power his father had wielded as a weapon. His confession was a silent plea, a way of saying, "I am not him." She nodded, accepting his truth without judgment. They moved away from the crowd, finding a quiet alcove near a large window. The city lights of Manhattan glittered below a million tiny stars in a universe she had been exiled from. A waiter, still flustered by the events of the evening, offered them glasses of water, which they gratefully accepted. "I was a fan of yours," Jonathan said, breaking the silence. Before the accident. My father took me to a performance at the National Theater. I was a young boy, but I was captivated. You made the music visible. I bought a program book and kept it. It's still on my shelf at home." His voice was full of a sincere, almost boyish awe. Kesha felt a warmth spread through her chest, a strange, beautiful sensation she hadn't experienced in years. This was not the kind of admiration she had been accustomed to in her old life, the kind that came with a price tag attached. This was pure, simple, and honest. The boy who had been in the audience all those years ago had not forgotten the art, even when the artist had disappeared. They talked for a long time, their conversation a journey through years of silence and unspoken truths. Jonathan confessed his own struggles with his father's controlling nature. He spoke of his secret love for photography, a passion his father considered a useless waste of time. He revealed the blackmail over his girlfriend, a trivial misunderstanding that William had inflated into a tool of control. Kesha, in turn, told him about the years of painful rehabilitation, the loss of her identity, and the quiet dignity she had found in her new life. She spoke of the young children she taught at a community center, the joy in seeing them discover the simple beauty of movement. Their conversation was a bridge across two different worlds. He the heir to a crumbling empire, and she the once celebrated artist who had found peace in anonymity. They were two people who had been broken by the same man, and in their shared vulnerability, a connection was being forged. It wasn't the fleeting dramatic romance the crowd had imagined. It was something quieter, more profound. It was a mutual recognition of souls, a shared understanding of the cost of integrity in a world that valued only power. "You know," Jonathan said, his voice soft, "when I saw you tonight, I didn't recognize you at first. But when you started to dance, it was like the world just snapped into place. It was you. The same spirit, the same fire. It was all still there." A single tear rolled down Kesha's cheek, not of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. After 15 years, someone had finally seen her, truly seen her, not for the dancer she was, or the cleaner she was, but for the person she had become. The humiliation she had endured at the hands of William Thompson had been a brutal, painful experience, but in a strange, twisted way, it had led her to this moment. It had forced her out of the shadows and into the light where the truth could finally be told. And now, as the night wound down and the guests began to trickle out, a new story was beginning, one not of revenge but of redemption, and of a quiet, unexpected love born from the ashes of a public spectacle. The recording of William Thompson's public humiliation, a cold and clinical documentation of his arrogance, spread across social media like wildfire. Marcus, the security guard who had been a silent witness to 1,000 events just like this, had unknowingly held the match that would ignite a global conflagration. In less than 24 hours, the video, now titled "Millionaire's Cruel Joke Backfires," had become a worldwide trending topic, racking up millions of views and indignant comments. The world, it seemed, was more than ready to watch an arrogant titan of industry crumble. For William Thompson, the morning after was a descent into a nightmare of his own making. He woke up not to the usual adoring headlines, but to a symphony of scorn. Every major financial news outlet was running stories about the Thompson Holdings stock plummeting. Analysts were predicting a crisis of confidence. His phone, which usually rang with offers and praises, was now a constant, shrill siren of panic. 3 multi-million-dollar contracts had been canceled overnight. His partners were demanding an emergency meeting, their voices cold and accusatory. And his wife Victoria had locked herself in her bedroom, refusing to appear in public. Her own fragile social standing shattered by her husband's monstrous display. He paced his home office, a gilded cage of mahogany and leather surrounded by newspapers with devastating headlines. He threw a glass against the wall, the shattering a pathetic echo of the crystal tray that had started it all. He was a man used to controlling every detail, every person, every outcome. The sudden, irreversible loss of control was a torment more profound than any physical pain. His empire, built on a foundation of ruthless ambition and cold calculation, was now exposed as a house of cards, its reputation a sham. Jonathan found his father amidst the wreckage. The young man's face was grave, his eyes holding a look his father had never seen before, not of fear, but of resolute disappointment. "The board has voted, Dad." Jonathan said, his voice quiet but firm. "You have 1 hour to resign or you will be removed by force." William looked at his son, seeing for the first time not submission but determination. The boy he had bullied and manipulated for years was now the one holding the sword. "You did this." William murmured the words full of a desperate, venomous betrayal. "You betrayed me." "No," Jonathan replied calmly, his voice a balm on the furious chaos of the room. "You betrayed yourself the moment you decided your arrogance was worth more than your humanity. This is not my doing. This is the consequence of your own actions." The truth of his words was a bitter poison that William could not swallow. His carefully constructed world was not being destroyed by an external force, but by the rot he had allowed to fester at its core. Meanwhile, in her quiet apartment, Kesha was being bombarded with offers. The phone rang ceaselessly. 3 international ballet companies wanted her to choreograph special performances. Lincoln Center had called, offering a solo event. Hollywood producers were interested in turning her story into a movie, a modern-day Cinderella tale. But all of it felt hollow. It was the same old song, a desperate grab for a story they could capitalize on. They saw her not as an artist who had found her voice again, but as a viral sensation, a commodity to be bought and sold. The phone rang again. It was Jonathan. His voice on the line was different, stripped of the formality of their last conversation. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you all right? With all this attention?" Kesha smiled. I'm fine, Jonathan, but I've learned to be wary of people who only see my value when it's marketable. She explained her feelings to him, her unease with the sudden onslaught of fame. I understand, he said, his voice full of an unexpected empathy. My father taught me that lesson early. My value was always tied to the company's stock price. I never felt like a real person to him, just a walking asset. His honesty touched her, creating a bridge between their vastly different lives. He had his own gilded cage, just as she had had hers. The offers kept pouring in, but none of them felt right. They were all about what she could give them. The fame, the spectacle, the story. None of them spoke to the part of her that had been reborn. None of them understood the quiet strength she had found in the years of her anonymity. But then an unexpected email arrived. It was from the community school where she had taught ballet to underprivileged children. She had done it for years, quietly, without any fanfare. The children and their parents had pooled their savings, a total of $23, to offer her a small scholarship, a way to help her get back on her feet, to give her a chance to open her own school. Kesha sat there looking at the email, the tears streaming down her face. It was not a grand gesture, not $1 million offer. It was a simple, heartfelt gift from people who had seen her for who she was not, for what she could do for them. It was pure, unfiltered humanity. This, she realized, was the true triumph. This was the win that mattered. She called Jonathan back. Her voice was full of a new, fierce determination. I'll take the offer from the community center, she said, but on one condition. Let's turn this into something bigger. Jonathan listened, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and awe. He had seen his father destroy, and now he was witnessing firsthand a woman who chose to build. It was a lesson in true power, a lesson he knew he had to be a part of. The empire of William Thompson was crumbling, but a new kind of empire, one built on dignity and humanity, was about to be born. The public's initial fascination with the viral video soon transformed into a global outpouring of support for Kesha. Donations poured in from every corner of the world, from small anonymous gifts to massive contributions from philanthropists who had watched the video and were moved by her story. Jonathan Thompson, now with a newfound sense of purpose, was the first major donor. He had taken a substantial personal loan against his own private assets, a bold move that drew sharp criticism from the few remaining allies of his father. He was no longer just an heir. He was a man building a new identity. The challenge of creating the Kesha Morrow Center for the Arts, however, was immense. Kesha and Jonathan had to navigate a complex web of city bureaucracy, architectural planning, and financial oversight. William Thompson, though stripped of his direct power, still wielded a certain influence. He used his remaining connections to subtly sabotage their efforts. Permits would be inexplicably delayed. Contractors would mysteriously back out of bids. William's silent campaign of revenge was a constant, frustrating obstacle. He sees this as a personal attack, not a new business, Jonathan explained to Kesha one evening, as they pored over blueprints in her small apartment. He thinks you're trying to build a monument to his failure. And in a way you are, but not in the way he thinks. Kesha looked at the detailed floor plan, her finger tracing the outline of a future dance studio. It's a monument to the children, Jonathan, not to him. The idea was her anchor, the pure, unselfish purpose that kept her from getting lost in the politics and the pain. She was building a safe harbor for the next generation, a place where no one would be judged based on their background or the color of their skin. They had chosen a dilapidated old warehouse in a neighborhood that lacked any public arts programs. It was a perfect raw canvas for their vision. Kesha was tireless, personally overseeing the demolition and renovation. She was a woman who had spent years cleaning up after others, and now she was building something from the ground up. The work was physically demanding, a constant strain on her fragile legs, but she pushed through the pain. She thought of the little girl who had once dreamed of dancing and of the children she was now doing this for. The pain was a small price to pay for such a profound purpose. One afternoon, as they were reviewing a financial report, a figure stepped into the dusty, unfinished space. It was William Thompson, his face gaunt, his shoulders slumped. He was no longer the imposing figure of power she remembered. He was a shadow of his former self, a man adrift without his empire. He held a bottle of expensive whiskey in one hand, a desperate attempt to cling to the trappings of his old life. "I heard you were building this school," he said, his voice raspy and slurred. He looked around the barren space with a sneer of contempt. "A beautiful idea. A shame it will never get off the ground. Jonathan's hand clenched into a fist, but Kesha put a hand on his arm, a silent plea for calm. She walked toward William, meeting him in the center of the dust-covered floor. There was no hatred in her eyes, only a profound, heartbreaking pity. "It will get off the ground, Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "because it is not built on greed. It is built on something you could never understand. I'm here to help," he said, his arrogance returning in a pathetic flicker. "I can make a few calls. Fix this. I can fund it. You and we can be a team again. The world will forget everything if we rebuild. Your story could be my story too. A story of redemption." Kesha looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not a monster. He was a broken man, incapable of understanding a world that did not revolve around him. He saw her story not as a human journey, but as a business opportunity, a brand to be salvaged. He was incapable of genuine remorse. "What you call redemption, I call another transaction. Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "you want to buy your way out of your own shame. You want to pay off your guilt with money, just as you always have. The things you did, to me, to your family, to your own reputation. Those things cannot be fixed with a check. They can only be acknowledged with a humility you have never possessed." "You are just as cruel as I am," he roared, his desperation finally breaking through. "You want to watch me suffer. This is your revenge." "My revenge is not in your suffering," Kesha replied, a sad smile touching her lips. "My revenge is in what I am building. It is in the joy of the children who will dance here. It is in the love of your son who has chosen integrity over everything you have ever offered him. And it is in the peace I feel knowing that I am finally free from your power. I don't need your help. You have nothing left to offer." William Thompson stared at her. The mask of arrogance completely gone, replaced by a raw, painful truth. He had lost. He had not only been publicly humiliated and financially ruined, but he had lost the one person in his life who had ever truly loved him, his son. The woman he had tried to break had not only survived, she had flourished. He stood there for a long moment, a broken monument to his own hubris, before he turned and stumbled back out into the street. The dust-covered silence of the center was a more profound rebuke than any words she could have spoken. The final preparations for the opening of the Kesha Morrow Center for the Arts were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Carpenters hammered, painters touched up walls, and sound engineers calibrated the acoustics of the main studio. The old warehouse, once a dusty monument to industrial decay, now buzzed with the energy of creation. Jonathan had overseen the construction with a meticulous eye for detail, his background in business proving to be an invaluable asset. He had a natural talent for organization and a quiet determination that mirrored Kesha's own. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of public humiliation and shared purpose, had deepened into a bond that was at once romantic and a partnership built on a foundation of mutual respect. One evening, as they stood together in the vast, empty main studio, the light of the setting sun filtering through the new windows, Jonathan turned to Kesha. "My father is completely gone, you know," he said, his voice quiet. "The board officially voted him out last week. Victoria has filed for divorce and moved to Europe. He's a pariah now. His reputation, the one he built everything on, is in ruins." Kesha looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and a strange, unexpected emptiness. The victory was complete. The man who had caused her so much pain had lost everything. But the triumph she had envisioned in her darkest moments, the pure, unadulterated joy of seeing him fall, was not there. She realized that the anger and the desire for revenge had been a part of her journey, but they were not the destination. The true destination was this place, this peace. "He's a ghost now," she said softly, her eyes scanning the beautiful unfinished space. "Just like I was for so long. Are you happy?" Jonathan asked, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability. He had given up everything to stand by her, to help her build this dream. He needed to know it was enough. Kesha smiled, a genuine, luminous smile that reached her eyes. "I'm happier than I've been in 15 years, Jonathan. And it has nothing to do with him losing everything. It has to do with us building something." Their hands found each other, a simple, comforting touch that spoke volumes. They were not two people trying to fill a void left by a powerful man. They were two people building something new from the ashes of their old lives. Kesha had found a purpose beyond her own personal triumph, and Jonathan had found a purpose beyond his inherited wealth. A few days before the grand opening, a small, unassuming car pulled up to the curb. William Thompson stepped out. He was dressed in a worn suit that seemed to hang from his once powerful frame. His face was etched with a profound weariness, the lines of his mouth pulled down into a permanent scowl. He was no longer the imposing figure who commanded attention. He was just a man, a broken man. He didn't walk inside. He stood across the street in the shadows watching. He watched as Kesha and Jonathan laughed together as they directed workers, their passion for the project evident in every gesture. He watched as a group of children from the old community center arrived, their faces bright with excitement. They were the children Kesha had taught, the ones who had pooled their savings to help her. They ran into the building, their small bodies a testament to a future he could never touch. Kesha felt his gaze before she saw him. It was a cold, familiar weight. She looked up and across the street, her eyes meeting his. She saw the rage, the despair, the profound loss in his eyes. He had come not for revenge, but for some form of closure, some final look at the person who had orchestrated his downfall. He expected her to look at him with triumph. He expected her to revel in his suffering, but he was met with something else entirely. He was met with a quiet compassion, a serene dignity that was the final crushing blow. He had tried to break her, to turn her into a bitter, resentful woman. But instead, she had become a symbol of something he would never understand: the power of forgiveness, of rebuilding, of finding true strength, not in what you have, but in what you can give. He saw the peace on her face, the genuine connection she shared with his son, the joy in the eyes of the children who had come to her. He saw a future. He had no part in a world that had moved on without him. There was no anger, no hatred, no gloating. Just a quiet, unassailable strength. He had lost not just the money and the reputation, but the very meaning of his life. He turned and walked away, a solitary figure disappearing into the twilight. Kesha watched him go, feeling a deep, quiet sense of finality. The chapter of her life that had been defined by him was now closed. She had won not by destroying him, but by building something so beautiful and meaningful that his cruelty seemed insignificant in comparison. The ghost of William Thompson III, the man who had once ruled her life, was now just a whisper in the wind. The future was here in this building, in the eyes of these children, and in the hands of the man who had chosen to stand by her side. The grand opening of the Kesha Morrow Center for the Arts was not a lavish affair. There was no red carpet, no grand speeches from politicians. Instead, it was a celebration filled with the laughter of children, the warm light of a late afternoon sun, and the quiet dignity of a community that had found a new heart. Jonathan Thompson, now officially running a completely revamped version of the family business focused on social responsibility, stood proudly beside Kesha. He had been the first major donor, a silent testament to a new kind of power, one not built on fear, but on integrity. Kesha, dressed in a simple white dress, looked at the children gathering on the main studio floor. They were a diverse group, a living tapestry of the city's future, their faces bright with a mix of awe and excitement. This was her true masterpiece, a living monument to the belief that art should be for everyone. She watched as they took their first ballet steps, clumsy, but filled with a profound joy that transcended technique. She felt a fulfillment far deeper than any standing ovation had ever given her. The climax of the day's celebration was not a professional performance, but a simple demonstration. Kesha took the floor with her students. The music was a familiar waltz, a piece that was once a symbol of her humiliation. But today it was a symbol of her rebirth. She danced with the children, her movements simple and pure, her focus on guiding their little hands and feet. This was not a performance for an audience. It was a shared experience, a lesson in how art could connect people, and how true power lay not in dominating others, but in lifting them up. William Thompson, a ghost from her past, watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows of a building across the street. He was a man who had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his family. His wife Victoria had filed for divorce and moved to Europe, taking a substantial portion of his remaining assets. He was now working as a low-level consultant at a small firm, a pathetic shadow of the arrogant titan he once was. He saw his son, the boy he had tried to mold in his own cruel image, standing by the woman he had tried to break. He saw the genuine respect and love in their eyes. He saw the future he had forfeited not with money, but with his own poisoned soul. He had sought to destroy Kesha's dignity, and in the process he had annihilated his own. Marcus, the security guard, stood beside Kesha, a quiet smile on his face. "You know what impresses me most about this whole story," he said softly, watching the children dance. "It wasn't just a victory over prejudice. It was a lesson in how true nobility responds to cruelty." Kesha, now recognized once again as one of the greatest artists of her generation, smiled as she watched her new students. "Sometimes," she said, "we have to lose everything to discover who we really are. And sometimes people have to lose everything to learn who they should never have tried to be." Jonathan approached, carrying flowers he had picked from the garden he had planted around the center himself. "Ready for dinner?" he asked, offering his arm to Kesha. "Ready," she replied, accepting not only his arm, but the new life she had built on the ashes of her old one. Her true revenge wasn't in destroying William Thompson. It was in building something so beautiful and inspiring that his cruelty seemed insignificant in comparison. She had proven that when we face prejudice with dignity and respond to hatred with excellence, we don't just win, we transform the world around us. In the end, the story of William Thompson's fall and Kesha Morrow's rise became a modern fable. It proved that a person's true worth is not measured by their bank account or social standing, but by their humanity and resilience. The Thompson legacy was not his crumbling empire, but the new one built by his son, a testament to a different kind of power. And the legacy of Kesha Morrow was not just her past as a legendary dancer, but her future as a teacher, and an inspiration, a woman who proved that the best response to those who underestimate you is simply to be extraordinary. Thank you for watching this story. If you were touched by Kesha's journey, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that will remind you of the extraordinary power of the human spirit.